So, for our first program, we'll be talking about essentialism. What is it? Why do we care? And why would anybody consider it a problem? But first, some housekeeping. The avatar I'm using, Bat Shy, was borrowed from a friend, and it turns out to be made by an artist called Waz. Now, I tried to contact them so I could ask permission to use it, or maybe sling them some dollars for the hard work, but it turns out the DeviantArt account has been closed down, so I couldn't get hold of them. So I'm using it without permission, as I can't contact them. So if you are Waz, or you know Waz, let me know, and I'll credit you, pay you, or remove the avatar as appropriate. How come it's there? Well, talking into a mic is kind of easy. It's something I do on a regular basis. Trying to remember everything while also being aware of every gesture and movement is not. And it seems I have a nervous habit of bouncing on my feet, which I didn't discover until I started editing my hello and welcome to my channel video. This might change as I get a bit more confident. Bonus points if you recognize the tiny intro theme. Long intro themes annoy me, and I assume the same goes for everybody else. So, on to our first episode. Essentialism. Why is this our first topic? Because it is a root cause of a number of things we're going to discuss later. Identity, personality, why some people have issues with other people being transgender, racism, and a few other things. So what is it? Well, to quote the dictionary, and this would be quote number 1, essentialism is the view that every entity has a set of attributes that are necessary to its identity and function. Well, that doesn't tell us a whole lot. What does it actually mean? Well, in practice, it effectively means that people have a belief in a near magical essence that makes a thing into that thing. That, for example, a car has an essence of carness that makes it into a car, as opposed to a car simply being a label we apply to a collection of parts that do a job, like drive around. Well, who does that? It seems kind of silly, doesn't it? Well, to be honest, most people do it. But why? Well, the short answer is cognitive bias. We can't help it. We look at a rusted out wrecked car that will never move again, and we still think of it as a car. Even though it has no windows, the engine is a solid block of rust, and the wheels don't even turn. Which is one reason why we are so impressed when someone turns an old rusted car into a planter, or turns an old TV into a fish tank or something. Because on some level, that person has overcome that essence and made a thing that we think is one thing into another. And we recognize that in some way this is hard. And so when we see somebody doing it, we get quite impressed. Another example which demonstrates this, and will be dealt with in greater detail in another video, is the ship of Theseus, which is an example about how we think of identity. And here's the example in short form, although it's available elsewhere on YouTube. There's an adventurer, Theseus. He sets sail in his ship for many a year, going adventuring. Along the way, the ship becomes worn and damaged, and so plank by plank, bolt by bolt, they replace the broken parts of the ship. When they make it back home, the whole ship has been replaced. Every plank, every screw, every bolt, every nail. Even though it looks the same. The question is it the same ship? Now, if you think about that for a moment, it's going to seem a little weird, a little tricky. And the difficulty answering this question shows why we tend to have an essentialist view of identity. The thing is, the same goes for people, as cells and atoms are replaced almost every year. This would be footnote number 2. And yet we still feel like us, even though none of us is the same us that was here 5 years ago. The cells are replaced, and the atoms that make up the cells are also cycled in and out and therefore replaced. And yet we accept that, sure, we've grown over the years, but we're essentially the same person. In terms of identity, the unique thing that makes us us is not the component parts, but the patterns that they make. So why is it that we do this? Well, I don't know. But I can hazard a guess. Evolution. It's the answer to most of these why do humans do weird things questions. The proto-human, the tribesmen on the African plains 100,000 years ago, or even further back, perhaps even millions of years ago, that would-be human that has a simple mental model and can process that model rapidly, more rapidly than their neighbor, and use that to avoid danger or react faster in a fight, is going to have an advantage. They will be able to escape the tigers or the lions just that little bit quicker. And the tigers and the lions, they don't take down everybody, just the slow ones. And they'll likely use that advantage to increase their breeding success and thus pass that trait on. Mental models, or at least the brain hardware that uses those models, can be passed on, unlike ideas. Simple mental models are fast. They're also easy. Okay, so why do we care? Well, this idea of intrinsic essence of thingness can be seen in a lot of different places, and not all of them are good. Racism, transphobia, and homophobia all spring to mind. Anybody who's argued with a race realist or a transphobe or whatever, homophobes being a bit less common these days, certainly around my parts, they will say X is really a man, and they will have encountered essentialism in some form. It's especially obvious in transphobia, and I have an episode planned on why we are so freaked out by the existence of trans people. And it's so obvious, you kick yourself. There's a reason it tends very strongly to break down over political lines like left and right, but more on that later. Note to self, do not eat super hot sauce and then do dictation for a couple of minutes. Not a smart move. Anyway, the current model for sex, yes, not gender, is that there are a set of sexual characteristics. Things like broad shoulders, broad hips, chest hair, breasts, penis, vagina, and so on. And we label these male or female. If you have enough of these characteristics, you're labeled male or female, depending on which characteristics there are and how many of them you have. The problem comes when these characteristics have exceptions, and people are generally okay with these exceptions individually, like a man who can't grow a beard, for example, or a hairy woman, or a narrow-shouldered man, or a woman with narrow hips. No worries, perfectly ordinary things. But when the exceptions start to build up, people get uncomfortable. Why? Well, it's simple. Conflict between the ideas of the simple view of this is a woman versus the more nuanced and complex notion of this is a person who also has a blend of traits. If we look at the similar position of race, we have the same sort of issue. There's no such thing as race, only unexamined ideas about race. Sure, a person can have light skin or dark, curly hair or straight, dark eyes or light, or even identify with a particular ethnic group, no worries there. But even with ethnicities of identifiable genetic markers, there is still no magical essence that makes them race X. Only a person with some genetic markers, often found in that group. For example, there are a number of markers found in specific groups of ethnic Jews. But even amongst unarguable members of that ethnic group, not all people will have those markers. So how can you be a Jew if randomly you don't have those markers, that haplotype, see footnote number 3, even if both of your parents are fully Jewish and you are not adopted? What is the difference between a person born of Jewish parents and a similar person not born of Jewish parents who also doesn't have those attributes? Most of us would attribute some essence of Jewishness to the person with the Jewish parents, but what actually makes them Jewish? To use another example, suppose you have a box of 6 orange sweets, and you call that your box of Jaffas, a sort of orange sweet. See the picture. That's how you think of it, and for sentimental reasons, you aren't going to eat them. But unbeknownst to you, someone has stolen them and replaced them with orange marbles, and you'll notice the picture is almost exactly the same. You still think of them as Jaffas, sweets, and when you check, there they are in perfect shape. But they're not, they're marbles. And yet you still think of them as sweets. Possibly you even plan on eating them when you're old and grey or some kind of celebration years from now. But until you check, you will go on thinking of them and calling them your box of Jaffas. And you would be wrong. Because you're confusing the map with the territory. Footnote number 4. All of this is an image, a mental projection built up in our minds. And changing that projection, or it being wrong, doesn't affect the actual reality at all. The reality is, each of us has a haplotype, which includes bits and pieces from all over. Calling ourselves Jewish or European does not change those genes. trans man will have 2 X chromosomes, and your box of Jaffas will still have marbles in it. And your ship is constantly losing parts and gaining new ones, even if it seems like the same ship to you. It only becomes an issue when we attribute meaning beyond the usefulness of the label and assume that there is some intrinsic meaning beyond the usefulness of the label, because that's how we go wrong and we don't even realize it. That's all for today. I'll be covering more of this in greater detail in later vids. My next few vids are going to be a scattershot of different topics, both to keep things interesting for me and you, but also to show that there's some variety here. If I promise to do a variety of things, but my first 10 vids are nothing but flat earth debunkings, and no one's likely to believe me, are they? And no, I'm not going to do that, though I will be discussing the mindset of flat earthers at some point. Probably, I should say, end of line. But I'm not actually obsessed with Tron, despite the greetings programs bit. So I'll say, see you all later.